Hi, thank you so much. Welcome to the Halsey Institute of Contemporary Art. I'm Katie Hirsch, Director and Chief Curator here at the Halsey. I'm using the microphone to speak to our friends watching on the live stream. So if you are watching, I'll remind you for questions at the end, you can enter your questions in the chat box below the video. But I'm so pleased to welcome you to the third iteration of WGS Intersections, and I'm going to introduce Kris Stolle, Director of Women's and Gender Studies here at the College of Charleston, to welcome our guest and introduce you to the program. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Katie. Greetings, everyone. Thank you for being here, here physically, there online. I am Kris Stolle. I am Director and Professor of Women's and Gender Studies here at the college and also Professor of Sociology. And I'd like to open our event tonight with a gesture of respect and acknowledgement, naming the fact that we are gathered together here on ancestral lands that were stolen after contact and which continue to be taken and pillaged, including by Monsanto, Bayer, and Dow, and denied through neo-colonial practices. This land was once occupied and subsisted on by the Edisto people before they were forced out through the creation of what we know today to be Charleston. And those of us who work at the college and study at the college work in and move through buildings and spaces that were built by and inhabited by enslaved people who also, let us be reminded, resisted that enslavement. We recall these ancestors and forebears to honor them and their legacies, to invite them into this space where we are gathered in community with each other, and also to remind us of the long impact of colonial slaver capitalist collusion that today manifests in agribusiness practices interrogated by our resident artist, Kirsten Stolle. So what a privilege it is to gather with you here today for another WGS Intersections at the Halsey. As Katie mentioned, this is the third event, but it is our first event back in person since fall of 2021, which is just exhilarating. At some point, we'll be tired of talking about how excited we are to see each other's entire bodies, but we're not there yet. So I want to thank the staff here at the Halsey. I want to thank Mark Long for his patience and persistence with me in gathering up the panel, Katie Hirsch and Liz Biswell for all of your support in making this happen. This is, so the framing of intersections, right, this is WGS Intersections at the Halsey, is rooted in women's and gender studies positioning as an academic discipline that is at the intersections of many other disciplines. We are an interdisciplinary field of study that is informed by and informing areas ranging from psychology to English and creative writing, from art to sociology, as examples. WGS also explores the intersections of identities and how our varying positionalities shape and are shaped by our lived experiences. We interrogate power, speak truth to power, and speak truth to the people. I see this as analogous to what Kirsten Stolle achieves in her border crossing work. And I'm going to read from this excellent brochure. For those of you who haven't picked it up, please do. Stolle's work collectively shows that categories of art and science are determined not by universal axioms, but by practices that circumscribe bodies of knowledge. Our realities are constructed by social forces that we shape through our actions. These artworks draw on corporate archives to collectively form an alternative archive of the artist's ideas about the social impacts of the agrichemical industry. The intersections of texts and materials that are present in this room and in the room next to us, of mediums and of her research-based practices are interventions, compelling us to see what is right in front of us as well as what is not, so that we dwell in her textual complications, imagining new and alternative narratives. making visible the wicked ploys of greenwashing, warfare, and industry propaganda. Stolle's art science work is arresting as it is playful, historically grounded as it is future-oriented. My colleagues who've graciously agreed to share their wisdom in the context of Stolle's exhibition are Marian Mazzone, Emily Rosko, and Jennifer Wright, who each have very different vantage points for us to consider. In the planning event for this event, we do have meetings to plan meetings, I was privy to a sneak peek of what they will share with us this afternoon. And I promise that what you will hear is edifying and provocative. Each panelist will speak for a few minutes, after which I will ask some questions, and then I will help to moderate an open floor question and answer session. I will introduce each panelist in turn, and so I will start with my colleague, Marian Mazzone, who is professor in the Art and Architectural History Department at the College of Charleston and teaches courses on modern, contemporary, and new media art. She is an affiliate of the Art and Artificial Intelligence Lab at Rutgers University and one of the co-founders of the Computing in the Arts major at the College of Charleston. She's also affiliated faculty in Women's and Gender Studies. Thank you, Marian.
All right, thank you, Kris. I thought that as the art historian, one of the ways that I could be helpful and informative is to talk very specifically about the works of art. So what we're seeing, what the media is, the vehicle by which she speaks to us, because I think our other panelists are going to talk quite a bit about some of the meaning and the content and the effect, the activist effect of the work. And so as an art historian, especially as one who deals with modern and contemporary art, I'm very oriented to the object and speaking about what I'm actually looking at. And so one of the things that I think is quite striking for viewers immediately when you walk in the front room is the color and the kind of playfulness of that work, such that you're seeing gold glittery bottles, you're seeing bright pink and aqua and orange, slick vinyls, all kinds of really luscious colors. And then you, wait a minute, what we're talking about chemicals and death and poison, so how does that work? I think two ways of thinking about that is helpful. One is this idea of Dada, and Dada put on the table for all of us in art that art can be humorous. And I think her work is really funny in a lot of ways, and I think that's okay, and I think that it's a tool, it's a powerful tool. There's one thing to hit someone over the head with a truth like Dow, Monsanto, et cetera, make deathly chemicals. There's another way of showing it in such a way that the audience has that moment where they stop, hey, wait a minute, for a moment I was sucked in by this. For a moment this looked really captivating. But then my next thought is, but that's what it's supposed to do. And through that little bit of twist, that shift, she's got you, right? She has you thinking about the reality of what the role of these chemicals are in our culture and in our environments versus the experience that you have as you're staying in that gallery orienting to the object. And that kind of little shock to the audience first is practiced in Dada, and I think it's very helpful for us to realize that the humor is a really powerful tool in this case. And with pop art, and you'll notice that she references it in the text as well, in the titles of the works. So we have pesticide pop, and we have, the rainbow chemicals on the far wall. And so she's orienting us to color and word by making those references. And the first thing I thought when I saw the bottles by Dow, Monsanto, et cetera, Roundup, that looks like Andy Warhol. Just put Marilyn instead of the bottles, right? Slick, vinyl, bright colors, et cetera, et cetera. And there's not so far a difference between thinking about those as objects in our culture. They're not necessarily positive objects, but they are objects that we know and are a part of our lives, even if we may regret the power that they have in our lives or their presence in our lives. And so for all of those who see in Warhol's evocation of somebody like Marilyn a kind of not just nostalgia, but also a pointing out of the kind of decay and rot of celebrity in American culture. One can say that she has very skillfully used that here to make a comparison with the role of these agrichemical business companies, whatever they are, conglomerates of all sorts of things, and to draw our attention to that. And all of those gold glittery bottles. At one point I feel, and let me see if I'm just being crazy, at one point I felt like it's almost like I'm walking in the toy aisle, a girl's toy aisle, however, because I have lots of glittery stuff, I have lots of color, and I have this moment where I'm kind of pulled in, and it's something shiny, and maybe I want to touch it, but then I know, no, really, this is very deadly stuff, right? And so again, it's that frisson, that moment of pull you in, and then bomb, in a sense, draw your attention to something. And I think it works very powerfully. On one hand, I don't know how many of you remember, and I think it was it Monsanto or Dow, when they would run television commercials, would tell us, better living through chemistry, right? You remember that tagline, right? And so this way that they're advertising, the way they present themselves in slick packaging, the way that they present themselves in advertising, has always got that message where they're trying to tell you, oh, how wonderful this is, and this is going to make everything better. And so I think that's why she speaks to us through these languages, to undercut or double that language in some ways. And so I think that's very powerfully how she's using color, how she's using form, et cetera, to orient to us. And so Agent Orange, we've heard about that, we know about the horrible health effects Agent Orange has had on people and continues to have. But yet then we've got this bright rainbow row of color up on the wall, and thinking about the U.S. Army literally naming the chemicals after colors, right? So that they would have an easy way of kind of classifying and tagging them, and such that, oh, okay, we'll use Agent Orange today, tomorrow we'll use Agent Purple, and the next day we'll use Agent Green. And in all cases, it's about how to prevent a forest, as she reminds us as we walk in that vivid green neon. Again, so the color, I think, also works to make a kind of symbolic connection between the ideas of nature, blooming, colorful, flowers, green, and then, again, not that, as we clearly read. I think this room, to me, is more didactic in the sense we have a lot of text in this room, and text is giving us a lot of information. The front room is giving us a lot of information just purely visually. And so that's at least a start for us in terms of material and form.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So much to think about. Okay, our next panelist is Emily Rosko. Emily's most recent poetry collection is Weather Interventions from University of Akron Press, which explores scientific inventions and meteorological phenomena, climate change, and the difficulty we have in naming the, quote, natural world without embedding the human as the center of it. Her other books are Prop Rockery, which was winner of the 2011 Akron Poetry Prize, and Raw Goods Inventory, winner of the 2005 Iowa Poetry Prize. She is also editor of A Broken Thing, Poets on the Line. She earned her MFA at Cornell and PhD at the University of Missouri. Her awards and honors include the Wallace Stegner Fellowship at Stanford, the Ruth Lilly Fellowship from Poetry Magazine, and the Jacob K. Javits Fellowship. Recent poems have been published in the Laurel Review, Denver Quarterly, Epoch, Missouri Review, Tupelo Quarterly, and West Branch. And you found time to be here with us. She's Associate Professor of English at the College of Charleston and also affiliated faculty with Women's and Gender Studies program. Thanks, Emily.
Thanks so much, Kris. I think the irony of, with you reading that bio, to be reminded that I got a poetry award from the Ruth Lilly Pharmaceutical Company, right? It supported poetry, right? And it continues to still do so. Thanks, everyone, for being here. I wish I could be an eloquent speaker like Marian here, but I've got a prepared little script. Kirsten Stolle's art, with its blend of image and text, is wonderful. It scratched my brain, to borrow a phrase that one of my students says when they read a poem that they admire. It's a good kind of scratch. Stolle's work, for me, activates the writing process, language play, and specific poetic techniques, such as erasure and collage, with a fierce edge. Her art questions the ethics of science and delivers a punctuated critique and counter-reaction to the biotech and agrichemical companies that profit at the expense of human and nature's welfare. What I'd like to offer is my poet's response to Stolle's work, in particular her 16-piece gridded installation, Faith, Hope, and $5,000, which marvelously is right behind us, which uses poetic techniques and strategies of chance operations to challenge us to consider pesticide and herbicides' pervasive impact on our environment. Stolle's approach to language as a material, along with the absence of language, powerfully enacts a critique of the Monsanto Chemical Company, its products, and its practices. Let me start with what erasure means in the field of poetry. Erasure poetry, sometimes called blackout poetry, is a form of found poetry. A poet takes an existing text and erases, blacks out, or otherwise obscures a large portion of the text, thus creating a wholly new work from what remains. Erasure as a practice stretches back across the 20th century. In 1965, the artist Doris Cross began painting over the 1913 edition of Webster's secondary school dictionary. Her process, she notes, consists of leaving found words, precisely where they exist in the columns. The found words, she continues, comprise the statement. Words as objects, textures, movements, spaces, sounds, words supporting words, even as a column is built of mortar and stones. In contemporary literature, the most frequently cited book of erasure poetry is Ronald Johnson's Rady Odes from 1977, which revised the first 4 books of Milton's Paradise Lost. Other notable examples include Jen Bervin's Nets from 2003, which uses Shakespeare's sonnets as a primary source. The O Mission Repo by Travis McDonald in 2008, which uses the 9/11 Commission report as a source, and M. Norbise Phillips' Zong from 2011, which uses as its source the legal text from a case against Gregson, a company that owned the British slave ship Zong, on which 150 Africans were massacred in 1781. So given this brief list of works, it's easy to see how deftly erasure can be put to political ends. Implicit in these works is the sense that the authoritative, powerful texts that the artist and the poets have chosen to erase are under scrutiny and are being put into question. Erasure is an ideal mode for interrogating and revealing relationships between form, content, praxis, and lineage. As a composition strategy, erasure is steeped in contrary tensions. This is because erasure relies on the process that highlights the symbiosis between destruction and creation. When a found text is erased, whether it's blacked or whited out, something else emerges from the old. In this view, original meaning is reinscribed in the effort to bring new meanings into focus. We can also think of erasure as a means of collaboration. With a new text arising from an old one, there's a dialogue that's created between the two. Even the experience of reading an erasure poem highlights how the reader and the practitioner of erasure are collaborators. The reader of an erasure poem must negotiate white space, fragments, silence, interruptions, uneven lineation, inaccessibility, nonlinear thinking, resistance to closure, and indeterminacy. The reader, as they read, mimics the poet's drive to make compositions out of decompositions, joining in on the poem's making and unmaking. Finally, erasure can be thought of as a means of confrontation, a challenge to the pre-existing text with the goal to dismantle the mark of another. With this possible act of dismantling, erasure rides the fine line between violence and liberation. It can be both an undoing of predetermined ideas, and yet it can also be a testament of survival for those unvanquishable parts, that which stays. Stolle's Faith, Hope, and $5,000 takes a unique and complex approach to the power dynamics of the erasing artist and the source text. For me, Stolle's work seems to know what Doris Cross knew. Cross described her work to an interviewer in 1981 saying, "I'm not a poet, but I am discovering something about poetry. Condensation can create an unbearable intensity." Faith, Hope, and $5,000 presents on the left side field a dizzying cascade of difficult-to-pronounce substances, all chemical concoctions from a 1970s appendix in a corporate history text on the Monsanto Chemical Company. The ready-made words inventoried here become the artist's materials to manipulate and reuse. There's an elegant visual fluidity to how the appendix lists these chemical compounds, how safe and docile they seem when they are positioned this way, as if tucked away on the pantry shelf. As any good scientist might ask, what happens if we create reactions with these substances, if we break their molecular linguistic bonds? Stolle does just this, removing every verb embedded in each chemical's name. The chemical words, then, after undergoing this erasure, are fragmented, incomplete, appearing as a random array of letters that further pushes them from our comprehension. But does Stolle diffuse the chemicals, or does she activate them? Stolle breaks the chemical compound, but she does not erase them entirely. Each chemical's active center, their embedded verbs, are moved to a different field, to that right side field of black. Each verb is dropped and lands by chance operations somewhere in that new frame. Many of the chemical verbs cluster and clot, a few go astray. We see coat and film, mold and plasticized, ate and deaden and sin. The intensities the verbs unleash are what the chemical products do in the natural world. The chemicals are performing these actions on other organisms. These are the chemical actions that accrue and linger, that break down slowly, leach into our watersheds or into our drinking water. The use of erasure and chance operations in Stolle's work offers a stark visualization of what too often we lose sight of, what is often obscured by greenwashing. That is, how present and how pervasive human-made chemicals and toxins are in our bodies, our foods, our biomes. And just as an aside, as I was writing this, I saw this report from the Center of Biological Diversity that offered this staggering data point that said that more than 2 million pounds of pesticides are applied. I'll go over the staggering data point again. That's okay. More than 2 million pounds of pesticides are applied to crops grown to feed animals on factory farms in the U.S. I might have misquoted the number here. It's 200 million pounds, right? Staggering, right? So Stolle's art sort of unsettles our accepted farming practices and our accepted, taking for granted agribusiness's role in selling us things like our pest-resistant corn or our weed-free grass lawns. Erasure poetry has always had a stake in social and political critique, exposing and playing with the power dynamics inherent in language, image, in our institutions, our practices, and our culture. And Stolle's work is no exception. By showing us what is missing, it becomes all the more difficult to look away. Thanks, everyone.
Okay. And finally, Jennifer Cole Wright is a professor of psychology here at the college, as well as an affiliate member of the philosophy department, women's and gender studies, and the environmental and sustainability studies program, and the medical humanities program. She has served as a sustainability and social justice faculty fellow with the Honors College, as well as faculty development fellow at the Center for Sustainable Development. Her area of research is moral development and moral psychology more generally. Her most recent book, A Psychological Perspective on Folk Moral Objectivism with Routledge Press, is coming out later this year. Congratulations. She also co-authored Understanding Virtue, Theory and Measurement with Michael Warren and Nancy Snow, and edited an interdisciplinary volume on humility, both with Oxford Press, and co-edited with Hagop Sarkissian, Advances in Experimental Moral Psychology with Bloomsbury Academic Press. Jen is co-director of the Charleston Climate Coalition, And when she's not writing, she's usually busy warping young minds in the classroom or in the field, engaging in local social justice climate activism, traveling with students to Southeast Asia or East Africa, or satisfying her lust for adventure by just trekking with the help of a fuel-efficient car across the United States. My colleagues don't sleep, apparently. Thank you, Jen.
Thank you. I didn't realize you were going to read the entire thing. But one of the downsides to going last is that you have to follow the wonderful words of your colleagues that came before you, and I really appreciate the thoughts that you've provided and the ideas that you've made more clear for us. One of the things that I wanted to say, I wasn't actually thinking about this initially, but as I was listening to the land acknowledgement and how that's just the depth of revelation that's provided there, it really strikes me as a wonderful example of what I take activism to be about. Because it's imagine if you come in, like as a college student, for example, you're coming into college and you have this way of thinking about the world, and suddenly you hear an alternative perspective. You hear a way of thinking about the land that you're standing on, the work that you're doing, the place that you occupy in the world. It's this powerful shift that does all of the things that I take good activism to do. I mean, so certainly one of the things that we're trying to do as activists is we're trying to, as you said, interrogate power, speak truth to power, and upend existing power structures to change them into something more equitable and just. But we do that in part by revealing that which is hidden. So the land acknowledgement brings to the forefront the truths that are right there, and yet they're hidden from us. And when we reveal things that are hidden, we might be bringing to light certain facts that are just not present before us. They're facts that are there, but are being they're either being sort of lost or they're being systematically actually suppressed. It brings to light patterns and relationships and realities that we might not otherwise see. It highlights connections between things that we might think of as being somehow disparate and disconnected. And importantly, it reveals the true meaning behind a lot of the things that we take for granted. And so you see that present. It shifts our perspective. So suddenly we see our location as privileged faculty and students, members of this campus, in a very different position and in a very different light as we think about the true history of how we came to be here. And there's so much more we could even know about our history as a college that has as yet been unspoken. So shifting perspectives provides new, unheard narratives. So as activists, we're often working to bring forward voices that have not been heard. We're trying to bring to light stories and experiences and ways of being that are hidden from the limelight, that are not being available. We're trying to provide alternative and conflicting narratives. We're trying to help to dismantle the dominant narrative by providing alternative ways of thinking about things, which we certainly saw here. We're translating narratives to reveal what's hidden, what's right there in front of us in the story, but we can't see it because it's hidden in the way things are put together. And we're creating bridges between different narratives and showing the ways in which they are connected. And most importantly, I think, as activists, obviously, is we're trying to move people to action. We're trying to stimulate a sense of urgency, stimulate whether it's we're stirring feelings and emotions, so this sense of, as you're listening to the acknowledgement, there's a sense of unease. The words, the way that it's put together, puts you in a position where now you have to enter into a new relationship with the reality that we're in. We have to think about, okay, now that this is made clear to me, what do I choose to do with it? How am I going to move forward knowing now what I probably should have known before but didn't know? It's like right here in front of me. It shifts and overrides other emotions and feelings that might be blocking us from action. It deepens our sense of connection to the aggrieved, whether that's historically the past, the present or even the future, especially with climate activism. We're thinking often about future generations, the people who are, all of the billions of people who have not yet lived, whose planet we're hoping they will be able to inherit. Magnifying our sense of responsibility for harms done, understanding the way in which we are deeply connected to the things that have happened, and stimulating an expanded sense of what's possible. I think one of the most important things that we need to do as activists is help to shift the frame so that things that seemed impossible, suddenly we realize we could do this. This is actually in front of us. This is possible. And so one of the mediums for this is art. So it's wonderful to be able to be here talking a little bit about the relationship between activism as art, because art is a powerful medium through which we do this. So if we think about Stolle's work in particular, when it comes to revealing what is hidden, let's think a little bit about what we have in front of us. We have faith, hope, and the $5,000, right? So what is it doing? It's revealing by extracting the action verbs, like the words of action in the chemical names. It's revealing the verbs like, deter, kill, govern, control, sin, deaden, and plasticize. It is quite remarkable how much plasticize is up there. It's like we're plasticizing the world. We're turning it into something artificial. It's helping us to see the nature of these chemicals. So they lose the context, the destructiveness of these chemicals. It's lost in these names that seem very scientific, but within them is the true meaning of what they're intended to do. Praise the Lord and use DDT reveals the connections between land management, chemical warfare, and ecocide. The fact that on the one hand, we have this picture of ourselves as making the land maximally productive, doing all these wonderful things to feed the masses, while at the same time these chemicals are being used to control those who are less desirable, whether the less desirable are humans or other living beings. How to control weeds and weeds are the enemy both provide and reveal the parallels in the language that we use to control our lawns on the one hand and our borders on the other, right? Because both weeds and terrorists are the enemy, right? And so language can be used to hide the severity, the significance of what we're doing. When it's a weed that we're killing, it just doesn't seem like it's that big a deal, but in fact, a weed is a plant just like every other plant. A terrorist is a human just like every other human. Monsanto intervention reveals the connections between mass agriculture and the industrial military complex. So there's this, and not only the industrial military complex, but just our man's desire, human beings' desire to control all other living things. Science for a Better Life exposes the connection between chemical and pharmaceutical companies. I mean, and the buying of Monsanto by Bayer. I mean, here we have this name, this household name that is thought of as being, that's where you get your aspirin. It's such a benevolent and benign company, but the reality is that beneath that is the same exact mindset that is relentlessly pursuing the production of these chemicals to control things in our lives, to control our bodies and our minds and the way we move through the socio-political world. So Science for a Better Life also reveals how the desire for a better life has justified and continues to justify the mass production of poisons and toxins and these incredibly destructive products and the prioritization of some lives over others, right? Some people matter more, some beings matter more, some plants matter more, some landscapes matter more. Just think of how I was in the class that I was just teaching before I came over here, this discussion of manifest destiny as the justification for the mass genocide of indigenous peoples and the mass control of wild landscapes and this management of landscapes. Our Roots Run Deep exposes the way in which chemical companies curate and conceal their true image and impact, making the profane look humane. right? So we hide the true nature of what we're doing behind this benevolent picture. And I was thinking about that with respect to the pesticide POP as well. So it can be used to shift perspective. So let's think a little bit about how Stolle's work is shifting perspectives. Pesticide POP helps us to see the manipulative and seductive way in which toxic chemicals are made to look harmless and fun and inviting, good for the whole family, right? Let's buy this. It's a beautiful cover. And it's this idea of it being built into pop culture. It's like the picture of the perfect family. And the picture of the perfect American life includes having access to these sorts of chemicals to manage and make sure that all of our landscapes, all of our homes look beautiful the way that they're supposed to. Plant protection helps us to recognize that the underlying motivation, so if you look at these gold containers on the ground, it helps us to recognize the underlying motivation, gold, in the mass production of toxic chemicals and the absurdity of allowing the mass production of plant and animal death to become such a revered and lucrative practice. It's like how many billions of dollars have been made in the process of killing off animals and plants? Destructing Jansen highlights, which I love that that's also in there because it highlights the male-dominated narrative of art history and the omission of female artists from the historical canon. And it's not a mistake that it's woven into this work that has to do with our mass control of the planet, of this worry of climate change, because of course all of these systems of oppression intersect and connect, just like women and gender studies is an interdisciplinary discipline by necessity. You can't study one of these lines of oppression without studying all of them. 13 Reasons Why There's No Great Male Artists flips that narrative on its head, exposing the absurdity of the absences that were taken for granted. Of course, the last thing about activism that's really critical is that it moves people to action. And I have to admit that in some respects, there's a lot of ways in which Stolle's work it's not, there certainly are emotions that are generated. It's a little bit more academic, it's a little bit more clinical than some of the climate work, climate art that I've seen, excuse me. But we have to acknowledge that only you can prevent a forest, right, is a call to action insofar as it highlights the reality that only we have the ability to target, hunt, and kill off entire species and ecosystems. And the responsibility for ecocide, the responsibility for climate change, the responsibility for the situation that we're in falls at our feet and our feet alone. And I think I will end it there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Marian. I promised edification. So I do have a couple of questions that I'd like to ask, again, because I was privy to what my colleagues would share today. Each of you spoke about relationships. So Marian, you spoke about the relationship between color and the sort of playfulness, but also then, and the experience of that, but the relationship of then the shock that comes with understanding what it is that you're viewing and being asked to think about. Emily, you talked to us about the relationship between words that are there and words that are not. And Jen, you asked us to think about hierarchies of being and relationships that exist or are being eradicated. So my first question is actually about relationships as well, and it's about the connection between art and activism, which you spoke a little bit about, Jen. So from my perspective, Stolle's work is in fact activist-oriented for many of the reasons that Jen mentioned. I feel that it serves as an intervention into corporate narratives that elide the consequences of their practices and intentionally deceive the public. The effectiveness of her art science motivates us, motivates viewers, I think, to reconsider everyday products that may be on our kitchen shelves or in our garages. as weapons of destruction, as weapons of harm and extermination. And she invites us to consider our own relationship with these products. I think in the ways that Marian suggested, we're sort of drawn to the glossy pink, and then we realize this is Roundup, right? And so the relationships between, with these products, these corporations, and their devastation. And I believe that implicit in that is the move for social change. So I'd like to start with you, Marian, asking what you see as the role of activism in art. And in particular, do you see Stolle's work as activist or as more demonstrative? And does that distinction even matter?
Oh, I think the distinction matters because it's an intentionality of the artist. Does the artist mean to show you things and then allow you to do with that what you will? Or is the artist giving you directives, right? Do this, do that, think this, think that. And so there are activist artists all along that spectrum. There are some who are very overt, very politicized, very clear what they want you to know and what they want you to think and how you should think about it. I think Stolle is doing something a little more subtle, which is trying to use the language, the imagery, the narratives of the industry she is critiquing. So she's giving us their actual ads, she's giving us their actual texts, and their actual words, and asking us to read through that language, right? So that's something a little more subtle that she's asking us to do. And to me, it's sort of like reveal, mask, reveal. So you talked about erasure, and I think that's also similar to how I'm thinking about this. She is showing us something. An artist needs to make us look at something. We need to see something. That's the reason to make art. Otherwise, I'd do something else, write poetry, right? So I want to look at something. I need to see something. And so this is a wonderful game she plays with us, that she shows us something, and then we get to look under the mask and see something else. And so this is why we cut out words. We look at the text and we highlight certain colors so that we see new things in that text. We pull out the words out of the bare corporate speak and learn that those words pulled out and put before us really talk a lot about death and destruction and killing and weeds and all of this sort of thing. So there's that kind of mask reveal, which is, I think, is very effective. The other thing I note too, and especially as I was listening to Jen talked about this idea of action, action after you see, that maybe not be the thing that is strongest in her work. On the other hand, if I'm going to try to be generous, she's showing me hammers. She's cutting things up, right? And I might think about this little X-Acto knife that she has to use here as a very sharp little tool. That's not like swinging a big sword, so it's not the big activist kind of gesture. But that tiny little X-Acto knife extracts a lot of little cuts, and it bleeds, you know, long and slow. And so when you look up here, you see this kind of dissection, which is so it's revealing in that way. And I think ultimately she's giving us some tools, right? Learning to read underneath the language, between the language, to, you know, think about taking one of those phrases and with the hammer and letting loose, right? So that's the activism I see in this. So it's a little more subtle, right, than some other artists. But that's my...
The 8 hammers on the wall, notwithstanding the subtlety, right? Yeah, right. Emily, a similar question for you. What do you see as the relationship between poetics, poetry, and art activism, artivism, some folks mention or talk about?
I'll be a little more brief than what Marian did, but I just think inherent in this style of writing, doing erasure, and I said this in my talk, right? It's a confrontation that the artist is having with that source text, and it does 2 things at once, right? It does those cuts, it does that bleeding, it does that kind of violence, and also subverting of the authority, right? And plays with it, right? And also too, it does weird things to us as readers of that text. Like it's kind of confounding and puzzling. I mean, how long I stared at some of these panels behind me trying to read the words and just, you know, think about how it was making me feel. To me, like when you're thinking about the side of the erasure aspect of Stolle's art, I mean, it's it's still showing us what should be seen, but it's like that's when it starts to get more cerebral too, and we have to start to think a little bit more about how the process itself of making that art is also a kind of statement, right? Challenging different ideologies, practices, authoritative kind of institutions.
Thank you. So Jen, also a similar question, which is, what do you see as the role of art in activism, or perhaps how are those intertwined?
So I think, as I mentioned in my comments, I think that that art is very effective. If we think about what we're trying to accomplish as activists, art is a tremendously effective tool because it gives us, it's like giving someone a table of numbers so that, you know, if you're trying to highlight a relationship that was otherwise not seen before, and you give people a whole set of numbers, being able to digest and understand those numbers is incredibly difficult. If you provide them with a visual representation of those numbers and the relationship between them, it makes it very clear and easy for us to see something that was otherwise not seen. And so art is probably one of the more effective ways of doing the things that I was talking about, revealing that which has not been seen before, revealing what's hidden, shifting perspectives. Arts provides a wonderful way for being able to visually and, you know, from using auditory cues, using a variety of different techniques to be able to shift perspectives and provide new ways of seeing things, and certainly stimulating a sense of connection, stimulating a sense of and I was thinking about this in the comments that came just before. Sometimes the goal is certainly to say, this is what you need to do. You need to go out and vote, or you need to do the following things. Often, though, it's really about just stimulating a sense of unease and injustice. It's stimulating a sense of moral outrage and disgust. Our emotions are tremendously powerful guides for taking action in the world. And when that's stimulated, when you see something and it's just off-putting, and it reveals something there that you hadn't seen before in a way that sneaks past you. It's like initially when you're looking at it, you open up to it, and then the reality, as you said, it's like you've got the pictures of all the different products up there, and they're inviting and they're attractive, and you're looking at them, but then you look closer, and the reality comes through. We've bypassed your cultural immune system that's trying to stop you from seeing it, and then it triggers a whole cascade of emotions. The ability to trigger that sense of absurdity, to trigger the sense of horror that then you're forced to sit with as an individual. And once that starts, once the cascade starts of shifting your perspective, slowly other things come up, other things begin to shift, and before you know it, you're in a position where you have to do something. Maybe what you do is you just reinsert the cultural worldview just kind of reinserts itself, but often not. Often things are shifted in a way that now you slowly have to take action, and a little bit of action leads to more action. And so art's just a tremendously powerful tool, and it's one that's obviously been used for, as long as we've been wanting to change things, we've been using art to do it. Yeah.
Bypassing cultural immune system. I'm going to have to remember that one. I have one more question, then I promise I will open the floor. Stolle, as a woman artist, I can't help but consider her amongst the multitude of women throughout history and across the world that have really led the fight against neocolonial capitalist and late-stage capitalist plunder, including women such as Wangari Maathai from the Greenbelt movement in Kenya, Marian in food politics here in the United States, Vandana Shiva's tireless work against Monsanto, and in particular for polycultures and food sovereignty more generally in India. So these activists help us see how women are most harmed by these practices, how our bodies are on the line, and yet also how we are at the forefront of provoking change. So this is just sort of an open question. would you agree that Stolle's art science work can contribute to these and related struggles, and if so, how?
It's one of those huge questions that we could think about that for a long time.
I try to be a good academic.
Well, first, I noticed right away that one of the things that you described her as is a woman artist, and we were just talking about that in my class this morning, that we always qualify an artist, right? It's a woman artist. It's never a male artist. We always say it's a woman artist. And we can see that as a burden. Yes, right, so that we always are qualified that way. But also maybe we can think of that as a role, a power role that we need to own, in the sense that we're in a position to ask questions and to critique, and especially in a science world versus the artist, because there's a powerful dynamic difference, power differential there. And so as a woman artist who is interested in power differential, that makes sense to me to kind of qualify this as a woman artist, right? Because in a sense, she is interested in kind of shifting and making us think about power and nature too, right? So in a sense, if you, as your examples underscore, this idea of a heightened awareness on the part of women towards the environment and their relationship to the environment, that we could see her work as fitting in that way as well.
I always think about this from the realm of poetry, so forgive me, I keep going back to that, but sometimes what I like to think about with like poetry, because it's an art form that not a lot of people care about. Like it's not earn the big bucks, right? It occupies this kind of interesting space in our culture and our society. And kind of because it sits on the margins, it can do things, right, that are unexpected or that offer these kind of social critiques or these rally calls for action, whatever it might be. And this is why I appreciate Stolle's art so much, because she seems to know this, right? Especially with her interest in text, right? There's certain things, a different voice coming from the margins that's sort of coming in, resetting the record, maybe even giving a middle finger to, the patriarchy, all of that kind of wonderful stuff, right? And it feels liberating because there's that space to do that, and she can sort of absorb a lot more of just our capacity to kind of tolerate and accept that these critiques are out there. So I absolutely see this work very much as being very much activist and doing the work to hopefully help enlighten us, right? I mean, even if you just go away today understanding, a little bit more about the corporation of Monsanto and its kind of legacy, I mean, that's a win.
In 1856, Eunice Foote was the first scientist to show the connection between excessive carbon dioxide and increased temperatures in the atmosphere, right? What we now know is the greenhouse effect. But because the work that was being done by women scientists was not respected, it was actually published under a man's name. Right? So think about all of the intersections here with this work, right? Think about so on the one hand, we have the science itself that is on display and that is being evaluated and interrogated and rearranged. The science itself is a fundamental aspect of the patriarchy. It's a fundamental aspect of the dominating, the power domination model, to use a phrase from one of the books we're reading in my class, that is driven us to the point where we're having these discussions. So we have an artist who occupies a discipline that is male-dominated, to where we have to say things like woman artist, female artist, talking about a science which is male-dominated, in addressing a problem that we have come to be in because of the activities of that male-dominated space. So I think it's a wonderful example of how all of this stuff intersects and fits together, and I think it's a beautiful aspect of what she's doing and the way her work is highlighting that, and it's a critical part of continuing to show those interconnections as activists moving forward. Yeah.
Thank you for entertaining the very big question. And Emily, you don't have to apologize for coming back to poetry. It's one of the reasons you're here. So I'd like to maybe open it up for anyone who has any questions for our panelists, or if our panelists would like to engage with each other.
Yep, sorry. So the question is, as an activist and one who appreciates the role of art in activism, what would be my perspective on the recent incident where it was students, wasn't it, that went through the, right, soup on, was it one of Picasso's paintings? Van Gogh's paintings? Yeah, sunflowers, that's right. And then glued their hands to the wall. So it's interesting because, I mean, what we have here is it's not art being used as an end to motivate activism, but instead, I guess, I mean, I haven't looked much into what happened or why. I certainly heard about it I just recently heard about it from a student, but an attempt to highlight the absurdity of our value structure, that we would place so much more value, for example, on a painting of a sunflower than like actual sunflowers and the planet that produces these flowers among all the other flowers that are produced. And I think that I mean, we could certainly talk about how effective it is to create change, or, you know, because there's a whole continuum of, do we try to create change in a way that is going to be palatable? Are we trying to work within the system to try to change minds without creating a big fuss? Or are we trying to really get into the face of the power structure and demand change in a way that makes a lot of people feel very uncomfortable? And there has to be space within that continuum for all forms of activism. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it certainly got people's attention, and it raised a lot of really important questions. Why is it that we would put so much value on something that was created by someone instead of the land itself, where the very things these paintings are grown? And I think it's something that we certainly should be thinking about. Yeah, it's a good question.
Can I just be contrary about that? I don't think you should co-opt another artist's work to do that. You're taking advantage of, and you're using somebody else's thing that they created to make your political point. I think that's unethical. Secondly, I don't think there's a connection that's easily made between your political point and doing that. Actually, what you are gesturing with, and basically what you're gesturing with is actually a work that's in a public collection. If you were actually wanting to go after the value of these objects, then please steal one from a private collector. Then make your point. But don't attack a public institution's work, because now museums have to be extra concerned about what the next person's going to try to do. And that's a real problem. They want people to come in and look at art. Now they have to worry about kids gluing themselves to the work. And again, it becomes a stunt. You do it for social media. If you see these pictures, these young people are posing so that they will be on social media. It's really about them and their concerns, but it's not very much about saying something substantive about the issue itself. As an art person.
Well, I was going to say, can I say one? I'll get one word in here and I'll be quiet. But it's sort of like, too, I like that you say it's a stunt, right? Because that's immediately what I think of, too. It's like for the drama of this, like, we're being activists and here's what we're doing. But, like, you know, we have lessons from the tortoise, right? Slow and steady wins the race. Like, change, activism is slow. It doesn't happen so quickly, right? That's why art can be powerful, too, because, as I said earlier, we're thinking about poetry. Like, if someone's brain gets rewired just a little and thinks about a new possibility or the new perspective or the new angle, like, that's a win, right? The fact that you can be taken out of your realm of convenience and knowledge and be stretched and pushed a little further. And you know, it's the slow and steady work that a lot of people do in activism. I think that it, you know, sometimes gets overlooked by more of the dramatic things.
One last comment? So it is something that's missing, right? So, and I think it could have, at least in the work that I've seen, I have not looked at all of her stuff extensively, but at least in what I was looking at for the purpose of this panel, it's very clear that when we're talking about both the side effects, the consequences of land management, the consequences of chemical warfare, the consequences of any of the outcomes of these chemicals are going to be disproportionately impacting our indigenous communities, our communities of color, the global South. It's so that's a critical piece of this story are the individuals' lives who are impacted, and it's not obvious in the work that I've looked at. It's certainly a big part. If you knew that part of the story, then you bring that to the art, but it's not something that the art is necessarily bringing to you, at least from what I've seen. It's a fair question.
We maybe have time for one more question or comment.
So I do have a question, but I'd like to use something Marian brought up to ask Emily and Jen about, and it's this idea of So I really would just like to maybe have your comments about that playful dimension to the work here. And I guess by extension then to revisit this theme of the female perspective, if you will, or women's role in all of this. You know, is that something that has a relationship to that idea of playfulness?
Immediately what comes to mind is just loving how Stolle toys, you know, I'm going to flip your word play a little bit. She toys with this other language, right? And, you know, I'm looking like, I forget what the title of over here is of this on the wall, but the way the message she highlights that comes out seems more hopeful, right? Amidst the kind of really gloomy text in black. So playfulness is a little coy, I feel, in her work. You know, it's sure the color is poppy and playful and all of that, but I think again, it's a type of play with a little bit of a sinister edge to it, right? You know, and with good reason and happily so, I think.
I would use the word absurd, right? So I think that the playfulness is useful insofar as it highlights the underlying absurdity of something. And I think that's, the work is really, all the different pieces have that quality to them where what she's doing with toying with things and manipulating them in a playful way is to really highlight the underlying contrast between the gloomy words and the positive message, or the positive message and the destructive underlying components that are there, highlighting that contrast that's otherwise hidden. Yeah.
Okay, so those of you who might be online, you must come into the gallery now with your brains full of all this critical information. I want to thank each of my colleagues for being here. Thank you so much for your wisdom and for your time and generosity to both the Halsey and the Women's and Gender Studies program. Thank you all for coming, and have a wonderful night.